my great pleasure to welcome you to what we notionally call a fireside chat, which is just a way of saying it'll be an informal discussion. And it's a delight to have Stephen Dedman here from Facebook. Stephen joined Facebook as Global Deputy Chief Privacy Officer in January of this year. He's previously served as Global Privacy Officer and Head of Legal for Privacy and Security at the Vodafone Group, where he founded the company's global privacy program. And maybe before we get started, can I just get an indication, how many of you have Facebook accounts? Okay, how many of you do not have Facebook accounts? Here, good for you. But you are in a substantial minority, and you're here to work out whether or not to join, and Stephen's presentation may affect that decision. So what is on the menu today is a whole series of issues about the way we think about data, the way we think about identity, the way we think about the sharing of information, the way we exist in a highly interconnected world. There are various issues we can touch on. What I'm proposing to do is have a brief discussion with Stephen and then really try and draw you in. There are microphones there, and we hope to keep this an informal and free-flowing discussion. So please do think about your questions, because there will be a class participation component to today's assessment. But let me start off maybe with a question, well, setting the scene a little bit and then posing a question to Stephen. So one of the most fascinating things for people of what I suppose I could call our generation, who grew up not really knowing what the internet was, and you can remember the day in which you first had an email account and the MS-DOS-based system that you were developing an affinity with. But in the last dozen or so years, the way we think about information, the way we think about the internet has transformed radically, and Facebook has been a big part of that. So Facebook was launched in 2004, but the actual domain facebook.com, I think, was only bought less than 10 years ago. I think it was August 2005. Someone thought they were getting a lot of money, $200,000 for facebook.com. Probably bought a few pizzas, but regretted the decision ever since. 5 years ago, at least there are various ways of ranking internet site usage, but 5 years ago, I think was the first time I saw at least, that Facebook had overtaken Google as the most accessed website. And some commentators said that this indicated the point at which, arguably, the way we thought about the internet moved from just being a mine of information that we could search to a forum in which we could share. And Facebook has really been the paradigm example of how we have come to think about information, not just as something we can retrieve the way we retrieve or used to retrieve books from the library, but the way we would have a persona, have an experience of the world. By its market capitalization, Facebook is now valued at in the order of $250 billion. And yet I've used Facebook, I think, for about half a dozen years. I don't recall actually paying Facebook any money myself at all. So maybe my starting question is, how is this possible? And how would you describe the way in which Facebook has come to play this transformative way in the way in which we think about the sharing of information and our interaction with peers, both in our own country, who we really know, and indeed around the world?
Thank you, Simon. So I'll start off with a sort of very basic point for people to understand about Facebook, which is it's a mission-driven company. You all know this. I suspect most of you know the story of how Facebook was founded by Mark Zuckerberg back in 2004. But it was a college project, and so the product existed before the business. And the mission of Facebook is to make the world more open and connected. That's essentially what Facebook does. It enables people to discover and connect with the things and people and ideas that matter to them. The business model that drives that was kind of secondary to Facebook in a sense. And with any service where the essential driver is to get scale and connectivity, which is what really matters to people on Facebook, is being able to connect with people that you care about, is not to make it difficult to get on. So our business model is basically driven by enabling brands and advertisers to serve ads to audiences on Facebook. And the way I like to describe this is it's a platform business. It has two sides to it. On the one side, we have people who use Facebook, as you all do, as I do, to connect with people and ideas and things I want to discover. On the other side, there are brands and businesses that serve ads on Facebook to different audiences based broadly on different interests. So the money comes from advertisers, and that funds the mission that Mark has set out to make the world more open and connected. And that's what Facebook's there to do. And it's not unique, because if you look at print journalism or if you look at commercial TV, these are products that would have struggled had you asked everyone to pay a full price for the product at the outset. And so advertising has been a business model that supported many forms of entertainment and content generation that would have struggled through alternative models. So our perspective is that advertising has been a great benefit to people by enabling people to use a product that they get a lot of benefit from without paying for it, meaning that if you haven't got a great income, you can still use Facebook if you're online. And that's a very important part of our mission. So advertising enables us to serve the community with a service that they don't pay for. And on the other side, it enables us to serve businesses by enabling businesses to present their ideas and products to audiences. We think that's a great benefit to businesses, particularly small businesses that struggle to reach markets.
So Facebook clearly plays an important role in terms of people's interpersonal communication. It's a kind of marketplace, but it's also become a politically contested space. It's had, in the Arab Spring, both Facebook and Twitter were cited as examples of ways in which people could communicate without the intermediary of government. In, as you said, a mission-driven company, how does that figure? Because the way I think you described it is enabling people to connect on an interpersonal basis. How conscious are you of the political function that Facebook plays in many countries, including Singapore? And that's maybe something we might get into later if there are questions along those lines.
We're deeply conscious. So you can't be as big and as prevalent in people's lives as Facebook and not be deeply conscious of the platform for all the things that matter to people, whether they be political ideas, social issues, business, or just personal issues. So one thing that probably doesn't appear obvious to people when you look at Facebook from the outside is how much effort goes into making sure that when we run our policies for the things that people do on Facebook, and how much effort goes into making sure that we tread the right line. So we have a very, very sophisticated set of policies around kind of content, the things that you can't do on Facebook, that involve violence, for example, or terrorism. These are things that we obviously don't allow on the platform, and so we take steps to take them down. And there are a whole range of other things which may also be controversial, that the platform is there to enable people to communicate with ideas. So we're constantly in touch with governments around the world who are, obviously interested in either certainly addressing things that are legal in those countries, and we, again, respect the laws in the countries in which we make the service available. But there are a whole manner of controversial issues that we have to manage very carefully by engaging with governments and making sure that we stick to the principles and the policies that we've established for the platform, while enabling people to continue to communicate and connect.
So one government that certain companies, I'm not talking about Facebook at the moment, have been prepared to make compromises in order to access their market is China. And I know Facebook is engaged in various charm offensives with China. Mark Zuckerberg's given speeches in Mandarin. How do you see Facebook's penetration of this very, very important market, say, over the next few years?
Well, so Facebook isn't currently available in China. It's been prevented from being available for some time. And naturally, we want to be everywhere. Our mission is to make the world more open and connected, and that includes China, includes everywhere else. How we go about addressing that problem is a problem I can't answer at this point. It's just clearly that's a part of our mission. Entering into any countries where there are requirements and restrictions or things that we have to consider on a case-by-case basis. But our mission is really clear. We want everyone to get the benefit of Facebook. We just got to figure out how we can do that in a way that sticks to those principles.
Okay, so there might be questions about this kind of macro level, but I'd like to bring it down to the individual level and again do a little survey. So all of those who, if you put your hands up again if you've got a Facebook account. Keep your hand up if you've read the terms of service. Last updated 30th of January 2015. Okay. One of the interesting things that certainly interests academics like me is the extent to which there's a separation between what people say and what they do around things like privacy. So most people say that they care deeply about their privacy, that they want to protect their privacy, that they think companies should not invade their privacy, and yet they engage in activities that display at least no reasonable expectation of privacy. So Facebook, as we've highlighted, as an important way of people interacting with the world, sharing information. What do you think, both yourself as an individual, but maybe as a company, if there is a company view, about oversharing? About people who, I mean, they're making a conscious decision, they're old enough to sign or to acknowledge the terms of use, but they're sharing information that maybe it's not wise. I mean, do you as a company have a position on that? You've excluded the terrorism, the violence, pornography is excluded, so you don't have, I think revenge porn, I think is excluded as well. But it's a well-known phenomenon now that employers will look through people's Facebook feeds and other social media records of their activities. And if there are photographs of them doing things that were stupid or when they were drunk, that might count against them. How do you as a company and you as an individual think about this question of the way in which people use your service?
So the service is all designed to enable you to connect and share. That's why it's there. So if people weren't sharing, then that would not be a reason for using Facebook. So our central mission is to put people in control. That's really what we're trying to do. Over the years that we've been developing Facebook, we've done more and more to try and make that as clear and easy for people to share exactly what they want to be able to share. Your point about oversharing is something that we absolutely don't want to happen. If people are oversharing, or they're sharing in ways they don't feel comfortable with, or they're sharing in ways that surprise them, that's a bad thing for us. We don't want them to do that. We want them to feel in control of their experience and in control of what they're doing. And so we've invested a lot of time and trouble in doing that. You mentioned in terms of service, but we've developed lots of tools that put people in a much better position to know what they're doing. Tools, when you post something, you can control the audience you share it with. We've produced animated guides that take you through all the basic questions you ask when you might ask about using Facebook. We created a privacy checkup, which is like a health check that walks you through all of your settings to make sure that you can control your information. And that's something that we do all the time. Every product is reviewed from the outset to make sure that you're in control. That's basically the essence of it. Of course, when it's a product that's designed to share information, it's not private in the sense of trying to keep it private. That would defeat the whole purpose of using Facebook. It's really about putting people in control and empowering them.
Yeah, and I think it certainly needs to be acknowledged that things have improved enormously, and it is a lot more obvious when you're posting. There's a little thing that says public unless you choose to from the drop-down menu. I suppose that begs a separate question, though, which is whether in this effort to develop clear standards, whether it makes sense for there to be one standard. I mean, is there an assumption, for example, within the company, and maybe it's impossible to do anything else, but is there an assumption within the company that there should be essentially one way of thinking about privacy worldwide? Or to what extent could Facebook realistically tailor different expectations or different ways of thinking about privacy based on the different jurisdictions or countries in which it operates?
So there's sort of two parts to that question, I think. One is, what do people want, what do people understand, and how do they use things? And then there's sort of a regulatory policy question, which is what's the sort of framework that you can put in place to help deal with those things. So, from the personal level, giving people controls that enable them to use quite sophisticated technology like Facebook and all the other technologies you use in your life is something that takes a lot of effort and thinking. Even simple things are quite complex. It's taken people quite a long time to learn how to use social media properly, and it's become more sophisticated all the time. Likewise, I have absolute faith that people's ability to use the controls around their data will continue to get more sophisticated. And that should be led by what people understand and what they use and how they behave, not necessarily dictated by a kind of a single set of standards. To me, that seems to be almost like a question for the behavioral scientists to figure out how do people interact with technology in a way that actually is meaningful for them. And there's a sort of second question, which is how do policymakers grapple with these issues? Because we all live in different countries, and different countries have different regulatory regimes and standards, etc. And I don't see any near-term solution to making laws all harmonised to some common standard. But I think there's a great deal that can be done through kind of soft standards. So looking at the way particularly kind of international companies and technologies are beginning to evolve within specific ecosystems to find practical, real-world mechanisms that make sure that basically people are in control of their digital lives. That's sort of a goal that we certainly have as a company, and probably provides us with a more realistic opportunity to try and provide standards across all countries that meet people's expectations.
So maybe one example of a standard that has essentially become global through Facebook is the minimum age to have a Facebook account is 13, which, as I understand it, is because of the US Child Online Privacy Protection Act. And this is a phenomenon we see in many other areas where a very big important market like the United States establishes a standard, and then it's simpler for companies just to say, well, that's the standard worldwide, because it's easier than saying, and in Singapore there was discussion about whether the age should be 14 or 15 in terms of certain personal data protection concerns. Similarly, the European Data Protection Directive has established standards in all sorts of areas related to the internet, but of course that predates Facebook by almost a decade. On this question of the regulation, how cutting edge, or where do you as a company and you as an expert see the best thinking about the regulatory question that is forward-looking rather than backward-looking, in the way that the European Data Protection Directive builds on the Convention on Human Rights, which in turn emerged from the Second World War, was based on concerns about government surveillance of individuals. How do you think there's a best practice in terms of this regulatory approach to the way in which we use the internet these days?
I don't think there's a best practice approach. I mean, you can see, my experience is predominantly from Europe. I'm a European, I'm based in Europe, and most of my kind of legal background has been focused on kind of European affairs. So in Europe, as you said, the regime we have in Europe predates the internet, it predates personal computing to a large extent. You know, it was kind of formed in a time of data scarcity. There wasn't much data about. People didn't have kind of technology in their hands, so they couldn't control it, and it was designed for that world. And here we are in 2015. The world's very different. There's a lot of data about. There's a lot of technology. You all have a lot of technology in your pockets, and you're all much more savvy than we were 20 or 30 years ago. Often the thinking about data protection regulation hasn't changed a great deal from there. And if you look at the regime that's been put in place in Europe, which we desperately need because the rules are very old and they need to kind of be updated, it's still the child of the parent, if you like. You can kind of see the commonality between the two systems. But my feeling is that, you know, we almost need to do some blue sky thinking around this stuff, and start to recognize that the way that people are using their own technology, the way that people are using data, and the way businesses are using data as a resource, not just as something that was a byproduct of digitization 30 years ago, is something that requires us to think differently about the way we regulate. And I personally don't think there's been a very clear articulation of, you know, what's the outcome? What does good look like in the future when you think about the way you behave and the way the businesses you interact with behave? And I don't think there's necessarily a correlation between the way we think about regulation and policy and that articulated future. So I think there are pockets of it happening. It's happening a bit in Europe. I think it's happening a bit in North America. I think I see it elsewhere, but I don't think there's really a great model just yet. And I'd like to see more work being done to try and figure out how do we produce all the things we want, prevent the things we don't want, and not stifle innovation around privacy as well as innovation around kind of data and business and sector.
Well, certainly with my lawyer's hat on, one of the fundamental problems is that the baseline of most of data protection, or the foundation of most of data protection regulation now, is premised on consent. And so there's a kind of contractual relationship between individual users and Facebook or the other companies. And the problem is that consent is often not very well informed. I think you mentioned the various efforts that Facebook has gone through to educate people on privacy. But the reality is that if one disagrees with the terms of use, you can't make a counter-offer. And I'm not just picking on Facebook. This is true of virtually all interactions in the global capitalist economy. So do you think consent should remain the foundation? Is there any kind of alternative to that? And is it just a matter of having people better informed? Or is there some other way of thinking about that legal relationship that regulates how our information is used, and whether we have, for example, a property right in the information that now, through data mining, is a source of revenue to companies like Facebook?
So that point about consent touches on, probably for most people, the thing that they most find irritating about privacy and debates about privacy, which is that consent's massively overused. And it's kind of overused for a number of reasons. But what I often say about this is, as a lawyer, I kind of blame the legal system for doing this. What's happened, if you think about it from the legal perspective, having advised on this to other companies in the past, is consent was often the easiest thing you could do to get your company over the compliance barrier, meaning that check the box and we move on was considered to be sufficient. Actually, a lot of the interactions you have today with companies that maybe kind of positioned as consent, but basically there's a kind of deal. There's a, the company needs to use certain information to provide the service. They may need to use information in addition to develop the service and kind of make it slightly better. For our business, we use a certain amount of information about people who use Facebook in order to make ads relevant to them. That's a kind of an essential part of the service. And those things should be kind of a part of the understanding of what you're doing. And then there are a lot of other things around data where if you think about the number of times that you may create data, interact with data, the idea of consent would make your life intolerable if it were really kind of strictly enforced. So we do need something different beyond the kind of a consent model. Consent was the consent comes from think about data protection law back in the 1990s, a sort of a medical context where it's a kind of high-touch interaction between a physician and a patient, where you're talking about the treatment and the consumer the patient says, yes, I agree to that treatment. There's only so many times a day you can do that. And it makes sense in those high-touch instances. But for the vast majority of interactions we are going to face in the future in the digital space, and I don't just mean the online space, I mean smart nations and cities that are connected with sensors everywhere. We need to find other ways of making sure that information is accountably managed, that people are sufficiently in control of their own digital destiny, but that data can be allowed to be used and as an asset that drives economic growth and social good and healthcare, etc.
Maybe just to localize this for the Singaporeans here, one of the provisions in the Personal Data Protection Act guarantees or requires that companies not demand that an individual consent to more use of their personal data than is necessary for the service they're paying for. And I can give an example of this. There's not touching on Facebook, but there's a South Park episode. This is a cartoon in the Canadian United States origin, where Apple's iTunes, which every month or so, it seems, sends you new end-user license agreements to acknowledge, and in this cartoon version included a provision that in addition to the various other provisions, you agreed to live organ donation on demand by Apple, which they then arrived to claim. That's a cartoon version, but there was actually a tech company, I think it was an English one, that included in its end-user license agreement a provision that you pledged your eternal soul to the company. And they put this in their genuine terms, and it was months before anyone actually called them on it because no one was reading the small print. So as you've highlighted, the use of information is incredibly important. You mentioned in passing that Facebook's economic model is premised on advertising, but of course it's much more sophisticated than just putting an advertisement in a newspaper and hoping someone looks at it. Can you talk a little bit about how Facebook has changed the way in which advertising reaches consumers and the sort of data mining that goes into both trying to navigate that fine line between keeping the purchasers of advertising happy without annoying your consumers unduly?
Yeah, so one of the benefits of kind of digital space over the analog advertising ecosystem is that brands don't spend large amounts of advertising spend reaching people who are completely uninterested in their product because they might live in a different part of the country where they could never experience it anyway. And so with online advertising and on Facebook, advertisers, businesses, many of them very small, can target the sorts of people they're kind of interested in who are likely to buy their product. It could be based on their location. If you're running a small bar, it helps to kind of be advertising people who are going to likely to be in the area. It could be based on kind of broad interest categories, and so on and so forth. And that's essentially the way it works. And that adds more value to the advertiser and to the individual who's receiving the advert. It's arguably more valuable to them because it's not completely irrelevant. And so that's based on utilizing information that people create on Facebook so we can get a sense of their interests. It's completely against our interests and of course the interests of people on Facebook if they get creeped out. Likewise, it's equally against their interest if they see ads which are completely irrelevant. They also complain about complete irrelevance. So our job is to make sure that adverts are sufficiently relevant to audiences that advertisers are trying to reach and that don't kind of become creepy. We don't want to do that. So our goal is to give people a degree of control of the advertising they see. They can choose to opt out of advertising. And we recently, just last year, developed a new tool, which we called Ad Preferences, that gives people the ability to change what we think they might be interested in. So, for example, when you see an ad on Facebook, there's a little icon in the top right corner. You can click on that and say, why am I seeing this ad? It might be because you thought it was a bit relevant to your interest and you want to kind of understand why. If you click on that, it will take you through to a page that explains what we think you might be interested in and why we think that based on your activity on Facebook. And then you can go a step further and you can say, no, you've misunderstood me. I know I was shopping for football boots last week, but actually it's for my son. I'm not interested in football, I'm interested in rugby. And you can change your settings and basically tell us what you're interested in. And from us, for me personally, this was a really exciting thing when I discovered this at Facebook, because this shows the shift from us just kind of pushing stuff out and trying to predict what you're interested in, to people engaging with us and actually telling us what you're interested in. And that's really valuable, because that information for us is super important, and it's super valuable to our users because they're in control. They're now telling us what they want to kind of see online. You can't not have ads because that's the way the whole service is funded. But we're kind of shifting to a world where we want people to be more and more in control and telling us, these are the ads I want to see, and these are the things I'm interested in, rather than just sort of trying to predict what you might be interested in.
I can give you an example of being creeped out, but you'll be pleased it's Google rather than Facebook. I teach a course on regulation and oversight of intelligence services, and in preparation for one class I was Googling about the way in which you can change mobile phones into tracking devices. And the Google context-sensitive advertisement, the top one that came up was catchcheatingspouses.sg, which showed that it knew where I was, that I was interested in tracking devices, and predicted, hey, maybe you want to keep an eye on your spouse, which I did not. But so this is a massive amount of information to mine, not just for companies, but also for researchers. And actually, the creeped out reminded me of there was some experiments, this predates your time at Facebook, where Facebook allowed researchers to have access to some of this massive amount of information you have on all of your users. As a researcher, I can see the value of that. At the same time, that raised privacy concerns. I'm not sure that they were all entirely legitimate privacy concerns, but could you talk a little bit about what the company learned from that experience? Hopefully it wasn't that you should never cooperate with universities, because that'd be bad for us, but the way in which the data mining that companies like yours can either undertake or allow others to have access to can be used as a research tool, while at the same time protecting the legitimate rights of individuals.
So there's, I guess, two parts to that. One is, just like any company with lots of customers, companies will analyze the way people use the product to figure out how to develop the product, are people enjoying the product, whatever it might be. And so Facebook is like any other company. We have a lot of information about people's use, and we analyze and look at that use to make sure that the product's doing what we think it should be doing, and it's kind of giving people the experiences they want, not experiences they don't want. So that research you're referring to, we're sort of looking at the kind of the emotional impact of, say, Facebook for people. And we were just simply trying to understand other ways that we can develop the product that doesn't cause unnecessary kind of emotional reactions in people, as you would expect, just trying to understand our product better. And what we learned from that process was about really being clear about the research that we do and how we do it. We have a lot of kind of governance and policy around how those research programs are set up and making sure that we're doing it obviously compliantly and ethically. We've improved and strengthened those processes to make sure that particularly things that have kind of personal impacts on people are escalated, so that we really, really think about whether that would be appropriate. So that was the kind of learning from that experience. It's really about making sure that people understood what we did and why we were doing it, and we weren't trying to manipulate them. We were just simply trying to understand how our product works to make sure that we can make it more effective. But then you raised another question, which is about working with researchers and doing other forms of research. The data we have is probably the single most largest set of data about people's interactions with each other that's ever existed. That's hugely valuable for all sorts of things, whether it's kind of solving health problems, understanding interpersonal relationships, any number of things that could be really interesting. So we do work with researchers to do research programs that help us understand how that data could be valuable for social benefit as well as for our own business. And yes, we have a lot of procedure and policy to make sure that we think through the ethical implications of doing that. But it's something we think is really important. We don't want to stop doing it, but we recognize why people might have concerns or might just want to understand a bit more about the way we go about thinking about those sorts of programs.
So one indication of how quickly people jump to conclusions about, well, basically anything that Facebook does, there's an app that I'm guessing many of you might have had access to, which changes your profile picture to put a rainbow in celebration of the US Supreme Court decision last week. And I think within hours there was a suggestion that this is clearly some Facebook experiment. And although it is actually an interesting question to see how long it will be before people change their profile pictures back, but I'm not sure what valuable data you would gather out of that. But the relationship with government maybe is something that we could touch on. You spoke briefly about China before, but in many countries around the world, people will post things on Facebook that governments are unhappy with. And occasionally governments will try and do things to either have posts taken down or have the identity of a poster revealed. What sort of policies in place does Facebook have to deal with those kind of interactions with governments where governments are clearly attempting to either prevent an individual posting something or to reveal the real identity of those individuals?
Yeah, so two sets of kind of policy issues there. One is our community standards, so the sets of rules that we have about what you can post and why you can post, and therefore the things that we take down if they contravene those standards. And the second thing is around requests from law enforcement for data from Facebook. So I mentioned our community standards earlier, which we make available on the site. That kind of take you through all the different rules for what you can and can't publish. But content like hate speech and terrorist content, that stuff we take down. There's a lot of other content which is not, which doesn't contravene our standards. And what we try to do, what we've done over the last few years, is develop ways of enabling people to get content taken down. So for instance, if people are posting information that might offend other people within their community, we don't necessarily want to be the arbitrator of those issues, but we provide a tool to enable people to do social reporting. So you can obviously report stuff to Facebook, and if it contravenes the principles we have in our guidance, we'll take it down. But often people don't want to do that if it's a friend or a colleague. What you can do is you can now report a message to that friend to ask them to take the content down, and very often those things are resolved between people within the same community. And the research that went into that was really looking at how do we in an ordinary human context try to deal with that kind of conflict or sense of embarrassment or concern about data, and by developing that tool we were enabling people on the platform to resolve these disputes between themselves. So that's sort of on the kind of content side, enabling people to resolve their own disputes and making sure that we take stuff down. And we have teams. It's done manually. It's done by people looking at reports that come into us from our users about content and evaluating that rigorously against a set of guidelines which we've made available and continually review.
Maybe just sticking with that before we get to the government.
Yeah.
As you say, it's a separate issue, law enforcement. Are those community standards the same worldwide? Because, for example, to deny that the Holocaust happened is a crime in certain continental European countries, but is not prohibited speech within a free speech country like the United States. So do you apply the same standards globally?
Yeah, so the standards are global, but they also respect legality. So if information is illegal, then we would take the content down. But what we would try to do is make sure that we only take it down in the country where it's illegal. So in the case of Holocaust denial, if it's illegal in Germany and France, then we wouldn't take it down across the board. We take it down for that country. And then, but our standards go beyond that. So if it's content depicting violence for the sake of glorifying violence, then we would take that down regardless, because that contravenes a kind of a fundamental principle, for us as a company.
Okay. All right, so sorry, I interrupted you on the way to talking about government, law enforcement, access to information. So
then there's access to information from law enforcement. So law enforcement agencies around the world, need and request data from all sorts of companies, telecoms companies, banks, retailers, etc., to help them investigate and address, deal with a whole range of different kind of criminal issues within their countries, and Facebook's no different. We get requests from law enforcement authorities around the world, some more than others, asking for data about Facebook users, so it's basically subscriber information. Again, we apply the standard, which is if it's a legal requirement in that country, we rigorously make sure that we understand the laws in each country where we get a request, then generally speaking, we comply with that request. If it's not a legal requirement, then generally we wouldn't respond to that. There may be circumstances where that would be an appropriate thing to do. So, for example, a threat to life. If there's a credible threat to someone's life, then that's a situation where we would proactively work with law enforcement. And again, just to give you a kind of a sense of how actively we sort of manage the relationship with law enforcement to make sure we're protective of the privacy of our users, so that we're not going to go beyond what you would expect us to do, while at the same time being cooperative with law enforcement who are there to protect and keep society safe. We have law enforcement liaison officers whose job it is entirely to kind of go out and talk with law enforcement agencies in many countries around the world, just to help them understand how they can interface with us, so they get the best use of Facebook and can do their jobs, while understanding the kind of principles that we have to employ to make sure that we're walking that very delicate balance.
Removing details as necessary, could you give us an example of a situation where Facebook would comply with a request and an example of where it would not comply with a request from government?
Other than where it would not be...
So a situation where it was a lawful request by government, the type of requests that come into Facebook, the reasons that are given for wanting access to user data, and an example of a request from government that you would say, well, no, this is not something we're going to comply with, or you just wouldn't respond.
It sort of the latter, it sort of depends, I think. There are cases where we get requests which our legal view is it doesn't fall within the requirements of the law. It may be a request that's triggered by, I don't know, it could be a kind of a political issue, it could be motivated by a whole range of different issues where we would, depend on the situation and the relationship with the country, whether we would simply not respond or decline politely and say, we don't think you have the power, and enables us to at least have a conversation with the authority in question. It may be that there's some misunderstanding on their side that we haven't understood, so we at least can engage with them to kind of refine and understand their request.
Well, maybe to give an example that some people here might be aware of, Amos Yee is currently in remand, and yet there continue to be Facebook posts on his Facebook page. If a government came and said, well, who's putting these up, or how is he putting this up? Presumably there's no legal basis for that. How would you, if you come across that kind of request before, or how would you, presumably you would respond politely, but how would you react to a request, for example, along those lines of governments that say, well, we want more information about how this person is interacting with Facebook?
Yeah, obviously the response would be a polite one, but if there's no legal basis for doing that, or any reason to think that someone's being put in harm's way, there's a harm to a person or threat to life, then we'd say, well, there isn't a basis for us to hand over that information. We would be handing over information without good justifiable grounds to do so.
Okay. I'm coming to the point where I'm going to be wanting questions from the audience, but a couple more questions from me. So you came from Vodafone, which is a very established company, to, I'm not sure if Facebook would still be called a startup, but a relatively young company that's moved incredibly quickly. What is the attitude towards the lawyer in a company like that? Because notoriously in many startups, lawyers are regarded as the person who just says no, or the person who you go to when you need something signed. How is your role as working in the privacy office, having that both legal and policy oversight position regarded within the company? Are you seen as one of the people who just holds the company back, or are you at the table when you're formulating policies moving forward? Yeah,
so first of all, I am a lawyer by background, but I'm not a lawyer in Facebook. I now work in policy. We have a separate legal team that does the kind of the nuts and bolts legal work. And this is sort of an observation, having come from a European company, just say an established company, It's interesting to see how different companies look at legal teams and policy teams. You know, American companies generally, this is my personal perception, take their lawyers very, very seriously. You know, in most of my experience, the rest of the world and in Europe, we're much more kind of, you know, that tends to be the attitude. So Facebook's lawyers and policy teams are highly respected within the company, and I think that's a kind of it's an American cultural thing. I don't know, but that's certainly my experience. And then to your question of how we kind of perceived within the company, certainly within policy, and I'd say legal to an extent too. Our job is really kind of to partner the business to do the things that it's trying to do, to create new innovations and new ways of using technology, and et cetera, to fulfill our mission, and figure out how to do that in a way which is just politically and socially and legally acceptable. So we're partners in the business in doing that. And a great thing, one of the things that really attracted me about going to Facebook is, you know, you really do get an ability to shape things and build things. We're very much focused on, you know, build things to solve problems and move on. And you know, I'm involved in doing that stuff myself, which I absolutely love, to be able to do things like creating programs and initiatives that help us become, you know, a fully socially conscious company that is very kind of careful about the way it, you know, treads upon the earth, so to speak. So as a policy and also for the legal team, we're very much partners in that process. Highly respected because it's the kind of that's a very American cultural thing. But it's not a kind of a, you know, you draw the line in the sand and then we'll figure out how far beyond that we can go. It's very much about kind of collaborative, cross-functional working. We do a lot of cross-functional working in Facebook, making sure that everyone kind of works collaboratively towards a kind of common goal.